Chapter 1. The first tremor was so subtle that most students mistook it for a passing truck. Arrow paused mid-step, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. The vibration traveled up through his shoes, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Around him, the Westbridge University campus continued its first-day bustle, students carrying boxes to dorms, parents taking photos, volunteers in neon shirts directing traffic. The August sun beat down mercilessly, and Arrow wiped sweat from his forehead, telling himself it was nothing. Then came the second tremor. Stronger, unmistakable. Conversations halted. Heads turned. A girl nearby dropped her box of dorm supplies, plastic hangers scattering across the pavement. "What was that?" someone asked, voice tinged with nervous laughter. Arrow glanced around, suddenly uneasy. He'd only been on campus for a few hours, but something felt deeply wrong. The air seemed to thicken, pressure building like before a thunderstorm. The third tremor knocked people off their feet. The ground beneath Arrow lurched violently, sending him stumbling against a nearby bench. Screams erupted across the quad as students fell, belongings scattered, and car alarms began wailing in the distance. "Everyone stay calm," a campus security officer shouted, though his own voice betrayed panic. "Move toward the—" His words were swallowed by a sound Arrow would never forget, a deep, guttural roar from the earth itself, as if some ancient beast were awakening beneath their feet. The concrete walkway in front of him split open, a jagged line racing across the campus. "Run!" someone screamed. Chaos erupted. People scrambled in all directions, colliding with each other in their desperation to escape. Arrow turned to run, but froze at the sight before him. The ground was disappearing. A massive sinkhole opened at the center of campus, expanding outward with terrifying speed. Buildings collapsed, trees vanished, and students, the students, they were falling, their screams cutting off as darkness swallowed them whole. Arrow's survival instinct finally kicked in. He turned and sprinted away from the expanding void, his heart hammering against his ribs. The roar grew louder, drowning out everything except the blood rushing in his ears. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The sinkhole was gaining on him, consuming everything in its path. The science building, where he'd attended orientation just hours ago, folded in on itself like a house of cards before disappearing into the abyss. 20 feet ahead, a girl stumbled and fell. Without thinking, Arrow changed direction, racing toward her. It was Mariana, the girl from his high school, the one he'd spoken to earlier that day. Their eyes met, hers wide with terror as she struggled to stand on a twisted ankle. "Take my hand," he shouted, reaching for her. Their fingertips had just touched when the ground beneath them gave way. The world tilted, and suddenly Arrow was falling. The sky above shrank to a distant rectangle of blue, framed by crumbling earth. Around him, others fell too, students, faculty, chunks of buildings, all plummeting into darkness. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. Something heavy, concrete, maybe pinned his legs to the ground. Pain exploded through his body, sharp and unrelenting. Dust filled his lungs, making each breath a struggle. For a moment, there was only darkness and the distant sounds of settling debris. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering from far above, he made out shapes in the gloom. Bodies, rubble, broken furniture. "Help!" he tried to call, but his voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered him. Arrow's head throbbed, something warm trickling down his temple. Blood. He tried to move, but the weight on his legs held him fast. The pain was excruciating, radiating from his crushed limbs through his entire body. That's when he saw her. Mariana lay just a few feet away, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her dark curls were matted with blood, and her eyes, those light brown eyes that had sparkled with laughter just hours ago, stared blankly at nothing. "No," Arrow whispered, his voice breaking. "Mariana." She didn't respond. She wouldn't. The reality crashed over him like a wave. She was gone. Dead. And he would be too, soon enough. No one could find them down here, buried beneath tons of earth and concrete. As his vision began to blur, memories flooded his mind, not his life flashing before his eyes, but something more specific. The events of that day, his last day, playing in reverse. His mother hugging him goodbye, trying to hide her tears. His sister punching his arm, telling him not to get weird at college. The feeling of uncertainty as he watched his family drive away. Nicholas texting him encouragement. Mariana smiling when he helped her find her dorm. Eros' breathing grew shallower, each inhale more difficult than the last. The weight on his legs no longer hurt. He couldn't feel them at all now. His body felt light, almost weightless, as if he were floating. A strange blue light appeared at the edge of his vision, growing brighter, more intense. It wasn't coming from above, not rescuers with flashlights, but from somewhere else, somewhere beyond. As the light enveloped him, Ero had one final, coherent thought. I'm sorry, everyone. Ero's consciousness then drifted, carrying him back to just hours before. Chapter 2. The August sun beat down on the pavement, sending waves of heat shimmering through the air. Ero adjusted his grip on the handle of his suitcase, glancing over his shoulder at the people unloading their cars, hugging their families, and taking their first steps into college life. The smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the faint scent of perfume, and the distant sound of laughter carried on the morning air. It was finally happening. He had spent the past few months imagining this moment, freedom, independence, and a fresh start. But now that he was actually standing here, outside the dorms of Westbridge University, it didn't feel quite as exciting as he thought it would. The unknown clouded his brain. What if I can't make friends? What if I'm just another face in the crowd? He shook his head, tried to shake away the thoughts. You sure you got everything? His mom's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Ero turned to face her, seeing the worry creased into her forehead despite the smile she was trying to hold. His dad stood beside her, arms crossed, nodding in that approving yet silent way he always did. And then there was his little sister, Janelle, arms folded, looking as if she was trying not to be emotional. Yeah, Mom. I triple-checked, Ero said with a smirk. And then I checked again for you, so we should be good. His mom exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I know. It's a big change, you know? Feels like just yesterday you were running around the house breaking things. Ero snorted. Pretty sure that was Janelle, not me. His sister scoffed. Please, you broke Dad's TV trying to dunk a basketball in the living room. You're lucky you even made it to college. Their dad gave a small chuckle at that, though it was more of a grunt. Just don't break anything here. Tuition's already enough without replacing school property. Ero rolled his eyes and smirked. His family wasn't big on long, emotional speeches. They showed love through teasing, sarcastic remarks. Still, even through the jokes, he could feel the weight of the moment and the sadness his family felt to see him go. He was really leaving. For the past 19 years, his world had been defined by his neighborhood, his friends, and his family's house. The same house where his mom's cooking filled the kitchen with warmth, where he and Janelle had spent their childhood playing games and arguing over the dumbest things. He glanced down at the crack in the sidewalk, a jagged line that seemed to stretch endlessly. For a moment, he thought that this is how his life felt, split between the past and the future. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. And now he was stepping into something unknown. There was excitement in that, but also something else, something deeper. Uncertainty. His mom pulled him into a hug first, squeezing him tight, as if trying to make this moment last forever, not want to let him go. His dad followed with a firm handshake that turned into a quick, one-armed hug. Janelle, though, punched him lightly in his arm. Don't get weird and start wearing, like, sandals with socks or something, she muttered. Ero snickered. No promises. And then, just like that, they had left. He watched as they got into the car, his mom saying one last goodbye before they pulled away from the curb. Ero exhaled, shifting his weight from foot to foot before turning back toward the dorms. Ero had always been the go-with-the-flow kind of guy. He wasn't the loudest guy in the room, but he wasn't quiet either. He had a laid-back attitude, the kind that made people comfortable around him. His sarcasm? That was just a bonus. Back home, He was the guy who was good at a lot of things but didn't really excel at anything. He never could find his thing. He had played basketball in high school, but never cared enough to try for a scholarship. His grades were solid, but he wasn't some straight-A student. He had friends from all different groups, bouncing between the athletes, the music kids, and the ones who just chilled. Arrow had a best friend named Nicholas. Goofy kid who Arrow had known since he was 6. Throughout everything, he had always been there for Arrow and vice versa. His other close friend was a girl named Emily, or EMS for short. They met in high school and quickly became friends, having a lot of the same interests as each other. Nicholas used to have the biggest crush on her before realizing she does in fact not like guys. An embarrassing moment for Nicholas as he found that out after asking Emily to prom. Her being the nice person she is, went with him anyways. Sadly, Emily went to a different college out of New Jersey, but Nicholas stayed in state at a different community college nearby. Now, at Westbridge, he didn't know where he fit. He felt all alone. Chapter 3. Walking through the campus, Arrow took everything in. The towering buildings, the sprawling green lawns, the sheer energy buzzing around. Groups of freshmen were already forming little circles, exchanging introductions. He tried to join one group, but their laughter felt like a wall he couldn't climb. He walked away, pretending to check his phone, and wondered if he'd ever find his place here. The thought of having to introduce himself to people made his stomach twist. He was never good at that. Nicholas would always be the one to introduce them to new people. Arrow smiled, thinking about all the times Nicholas would make a fool of himself, trying to talk to new people. But he never walked away. He always kept trying. Arrow, on the other hand, was not really good at that. As he turned a corner, he saw her. Mariana. She was standing near a group of students, her dark curls catching the sunlight as she laughed at something someone said. Her light brown eyes seemed to shine in the sun. Arrow's stomach did a flip. He hadn't seen her since high school, and even then, they hadn't spoken much. She'd been in his English class, always sitting a few rows ahead, her hands shooting up to answer questions while he sat in the back, trying to blend into the walls. He'd had a crush on her for the better part of a year, but he'd never worked up the courage to say more than a passing hey. A memory flashed through his mind. Junior year, their shared English class. He'd been out sick for 3 days with the flu, and when he returned, completely lost on their assignment on The Great Gatsby, Mariana had noticed his confusion. Without being asked, she'd slid her detailed notes across the aisle during group work. "You can borrow these," she'd whispered with a kind smile. "Just get them back to me tomorrow." He'd stayed up late that night, not just reading her notes, but admiring her neat handwriting, the thoughtful observations, the little doodles in the margins. When he returned them, he'd barely managed a thanks before his courage failed him. Another time, during a group project, she defended his idea when others had dismissed it. "I actually think Arrow's approach makes the most sense," she'd said, and the validation had warmed him for days. That was Mariana, genuinely kind, not just to him, but to everyone. She never seemed to get caught up in the high school drama or social hierarchies. Now, here she was at Westbridge, looking just as effortlessly beautiful as she had back then. Arrow hesitated, his grip tightening on the handle of his suitcase. Should I say something? What if she doesn't remember me? He took a deep breath, reminding himself that this was college, a fresh start. If he couldn't talk to her now, when would he? He walked over, trying to act casual. "Mariana, right?" She turned, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Arrow, oh my gosh, I didn't know you were coming here too." He shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Yeah, I guess we're both stuck with Westbridge now." She laughed, and the sound made his chest feel lighter. "I'm actually kind of excited. It's a big change, you know." "Yeah, definitely," he said in agreement. "I'm still trying to figure out where everything is." "Same," she said, gesturing to the map on her phone. "I think my dorm is that way, but I'm not entirely sure." Arrow glanced at the map, then pointed in the opposite direction. "Actually, I think it's over there. I just passed it." "Oh, thanks," she said, smiling. "You're a lifesaver." "No problem," he said, feeling a small surge of pride. "Maybe I'll see you around?" "Definitely," she said, waving as she started to walk away. "Good luck with move-in." "You too," he called after her, watching as she disappeared into the crowd. For a moment, he just stood there, replaying the conversation in his head. It had gone better than he'd expected. Maybe college wouldn't be so bad after all. Arrow's dorm was on the third floor of a brick building that looked like it had seen better days. The elevator was out of service, so he had to lug his suitcase up the stairs, his arms already hurting by the time he reached the top. The hallway was narrow and smelled faintly of cleaning products, with doors lining both sides. He found his room, 307, and fumbled with the key before finally getting the door open. The room was small but functional, with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a window that let in a surprising amount of light. His roommate hadn't arrived yet, so Arrow claimed the bed by the window, dropping his suitcase onto the mattress with a sigh of relief. He started unpacking, pulling out clothes, books, and the few personal items he'd brought from home. There was a photo of him, Nicholas, and Emily from their last day of high school, all of them grinning like idiots. He set it on the desk, next to a small potted plant his mom had insisted he take. "It'll make the room feel more alive," she said. Arrow smiled. He wasn't sure if it would survive the semester, but he appreciated the gesture. As he hung up his clothes, he thought about Mariana. Maybe he'd see her again. Maybe they'd even become friends. The thought made him smile, but it was quickly replaced by a strong hit of loneliness. Nicholas and Emily weren't here, and neither was his family. For the first time in his life, he was truly on his own. He sat down on the bed, staring at the blank walls. The room felt too quiet, too empty. He pulled out his phone and texted Nicholas. Made it to the dorm. "Roommate's not here yet. Place seems kind of depressing." The response came almost immediately. "Bro, you've been there for like an hour. Give it time. And don't forget to go meet new people. You're not a hermit." Arrow chuckled. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one surrounded by strangers." "True," Nicholas replied. "But you've got this. Just don't be weird about it." "No promises," Arrow typed back, grinning. He put his phone down and leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, excitement, anxiety, and now, a strange sense of anticipation. He didn't know what the next few hours, let alone the next few days, would bring. Something pulled him to go back outside, to get some air, to explore the campus a little more. He had time to finish unpacking later. For now, he just wanted to feel part of this new world, even if just for a moment. The afternoon sun had started its descent, casting long shadows across the quad as Arrow wandered through campus. Students were still arriving, hauling boxes and suitcases to their dorms. He spotted Mariana again, now talking with a group of girls near the student center. She didn't notice him this time, and he didn't interrupt. He found himself in the middle of campus, where a large circular plaza served as a gathering space. A few students were sitting on benches, some playing frisbee on the lawn. Arrow settled on an empty bench, content to watch the activity around him. That's when he felt it, a slight vibration beneath his feet, so subtle he almost missed it. He glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. Probably just a truck passing nearby, he thought. But then it came again, stronger this time. A ripple through the concrete. An uneasy feeling settled in Arrow's stomach. Something wasn't right. Little did he know, his story wasn't going to be the typical college experience. Because in just a few minutes, everything would change. And by tomorrow, he would be gone. Chapter 4. Arrow woke up to the sound of birds chirping, their songs familiar and oddly sharp to his ears. The sensation was overwhelming. Each chirp, each rustle of leaves, each distant sound was crystal clear, as if his hearing had been cranked up. For a moment, he just lay there, his mind hazy, his body heavy. The sun was warm on his face, and the air smelled fresh, like grass and flowers, but also earth and wood and things he couldn't name. He blinked, tried to remember what had happened. His memories felt scattered, like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. The last thing he remembered was the ground opening up beneath him, the world collapsing into darkness. The screams, the chaos, the immense pain, Mariana's face, Mariana. His heart raced as the memory hit him. Where was she? What had happened to everyone else? The image of her lifeless body flashed through his mind, making his stomach twist. He sat up, wincing as pain shot through his side. Looking down, he expected to see blood, broken bones, some showing of the fall he took. But there was nothing. No injuries, no torn clothes, just a dull ache that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his muscles, and a raging headache that wouldn't seem to go away. His clothes were different too, black, sturdy fabric he didn't recognize, accented with gold. He also wore golden armbands and bracelets, worn in places like he'd been wearing them for months. He was in a field, the grass tall and green, the sky a gorgeous blue. No sign of the sinkhole, no sign of the shadows that had swallowed him. Had it all been just a dream? But if it was, why was he here instead of his room? Why did everything feel so wrong? A shimmer of movement caught his eye. Turning, he spotted a small pond near him. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him, and stumbled toward it. Kneeling by the edge of the water, he finally saw his reflection. Arrow froze, his breath catching in his throat. The face staring back at him wasn't his. Or, at least, not what he remembered. The youthful softness was gone, replaced by sharp angles and hard edges. His jawline was stronger, his cheekbones more defined. His skin bore a small scar that ran across his cheek, fully healed, like it had been there for a long time. His attention shifted to his right arm, where strange markings covered his skin from shoulder to elbow. They weren't tattoos per se. The pattern seemed to shift and move under his skin like living ink. Dark lines intertwined in complex patterns he didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. When he touched them, they were warm, pulsing with a glowing energy that made his fingertips tingle. What the hell? Arrow shook himself out of his daze. He couldn't stay here. He needed to find someone, anyone, who could tell him what was going on. Without a better option, he picked a direction and started walking. As he moved through the landscape, a town came into view. Westbridge. His chest tightened. This was his hometown. But something was off. As he went into town, some buildings looked newer, others slightly different than he remembered. Shops he once visited had changed. The roads were cracked in places, as if left untouched for a long time. And then he noticed the people. They were staring right at him. Not just the occasional glance, but full-on stares, some whispering to each other. Arrow looked down at himself, his strange clothing, the gold accents, the worn armbands. He didn't look like someone from Westbridge. He looked like an outsider. Despite the unease creeping up his body, he pushed ahead. He needed answers. Spotting an older man sitting outside a small shop, Arrow swallowed his nerves and approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice slightly hoarse from disuse. "Can you tell me what day it is?" The man looked him up and down, frowning slightly, his gaze lingering on Arrow's clothes before responding. "The date." Arrow nodded. The old man scratched his chin, then spoke the words that made Arrow's stomach drop. "It's September 10th, 2029. Is that all for you, strange man?" Arrow, in total shock, just walked away. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him again. For years, his mother, his sister, his friends, they all must have thought he was dead. His breath came in short, uneven bursts as the reality hit him. He had lost everything. But the worst part? He had no idea what had happened to him in those missing years. And somehow, he knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 5. Arrow stood across the street from his childhood home, his heart beating out his chest. The two-story house looked exactly as he remembered, white siding, blue shutters, the big oak tree in the front yard that he'd climbed countless times as a kid. The only difference was the garden, which had expanded a lot since he'd last seen it. His mother must have seriously picked up gardening during his absence. He hesitated, unsure what to do next. Would they even recognize him now? With his scar on his face, long dreadlocks, and strange clothes, he looked nothing like the boy who had left for college years ago. And how would he explain where he'd been all this time when he didn't even know it himself? Taking a deep breath, Arrow crossed the street and approached his home. The lights were on inside, warm and inviting as always. He crept up to the living room window and peered through the gap in the curtains. His family was there. All of them. His mother sat on the couch, reading a book, her hair now streaked with more gray than he remembered. His father was in his recliner chair, watching the news with that same serious expression he always wore. And his sister Janelle was almost unrecognizable. No longer the teenage girl he'd left behind. She was a young woman now, her hair cut shorter, her face more mature. They looked different, quieter. The lively energy that had once filled their home seemed dimmed somehow. There were no jokes being passed around, no laughter, just silence, broken occasionally by the sound of his father clearing his throat or his mother turning a page. It made his chest ache. He remembered the dinner table conversations, the playful arguments, the way his mother would laugh at his father's horrible jokes. That house had been full of life once. Had him disappearing done this to them? He didn't realize how long he'd been staring until Janelle suddenly looked up, her eyes meeting his eyes through the window. For a second, she froze, confusion crossing her face. Then recognition dawned, followed immediately by terror. She screamed. Arrow jerked back from the window, panic building inside him. Inside, he could hear his parents' raised voices, his father shouting something about calling the police. He ran. His feet pounded against the pavement as he sprinted away from his house, his mind racing. That was stupid. What had he been thinking? Of course they'd be frightened. He was a stranger peering through their window, like some kind of weirdo or stalker. He was so caught up in his thoughts that he didn't notice the car coming towards him until it was too late. The headlights blinded him as he darted straight into the street, the screech of brakes piercing the air. The driver honked frantically, but there was no time for him to stop. Arrow raised his arms instinctively, bracing for impact, but the impact never came. Instead, a strange energy surged through him, emanating from the markings on his arm. They glowed bright blue, and suddenly a translucent shield materialized in front of him. The car slammed into it with a sickening crunch, the front end crumpling like a piece of paper. The momentum carried the vehicle upward, flipping it over Arrow's head to land upside down behind him with a deafening crash. Arrow stood frozen, staring at his hands in disbelief. The blue glow faded away, the shield vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. What the hell just happened? Around him, doors were opening, people emerging from their homes to investigate the crash. Someone shouted about calling an ambulance and the police. Another was pointing at him, eyes wide with shock. Arrow ran again, his mind reeling. The shield, that power, it had come from him. Somehow he created it. The markings on his arm still tingled, a residual warmth spreading through his muscles. He didn't stop running until he was several blocks away, his lungs burning. He needed somewhere to go, somewhere safe. Not home. He couldn't go back there now. Not after what Janelle had seen, and definitely not after what had just happened with the car. It would be way too risky. Nicholas. He would go straight to Nicholas. It was past 10 when Arrow finally located Nicholas's house. It had taken hours of wandering, trying to remember the way to his friend's parents' home. The neighborhood was quiet, most windows dark. But Nicholas's light was still on, a beacon on the second floor. Arrow climbed the tree next to the house, his body moving with surprising agility. He reached out, tapping lightly on the window. Inside, Nicholas was lying on his bed, scrolling through his phone. At the sound, he glanced up, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to terror in the span of seconds. He scrambled backward on his bed, fumbling for his phone. Arrow pressed his finger to his lips, silently begging for him to be quiet. He could see Nicholas's hand hovering over his phone, ready to call for help. Arrow mouthed, "Please," his eyes desperate. After a moment's hesitation, Nicholas approached the window cautiously. He grabbed a baseball bat, leaning against his wall, before reaching over to unlock the window, keeping as much distance as possible. The window slid open, and Arrow exhaled in relief. "Thank God," he murmured, slipping through the opening and into the room. Nicholas immediately raised the bat, his knuckles white around the handle. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly. Arrow raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "It's me, Nick. It's Arrow." Nicholas's face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare," he hissed, his voice breaking. "Arrow is dead. He died 4 years ago. Everyone knows that." "I'm not dead," Arrow insisted. "I don't know where I've been, but I'm back now. It's really me." "Shut up." Nicholas swung the bat. Arrow flinched, and once again, the energy surged through him. A smaller shield formed in front of him, and when the bat connected, it rebounded with such force that Nicholas was thrown backward, the weapon flying from his grip. He landed hard on the floor, eyes wide with shock. What the hell? Nicholas scrambled for his phone again, his hands shaking. Please, Arrow begged. Just listen to me. Remember when we were 10, and we broke your mom's favorite vase, playing indoor baseball? We blamed it on your dog, but she knew it was us because Rex had been at the vet that day. Nicholas froze, his finger hovering over the screen. And remember junior year, when you had that massive crush on Emily and spent 3 weeks practicing how to ask her to prom in front of your mirror? You made me sit there and critique every version. Nicholas slowly lowered the phone, his eyes narrowing. How do you know that? Because it's me, Nick. It's really me. For a long moment, Nicholas just stared at him, searching his face. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, wrapping Arrow in a fierce hug. You idiot, he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. You complete and utter idiot. Where have you been? We thought you were dead. There was a funeral and everything. The dam broke. Nicholas's shoulders began to shake, and suddenly he was sobbing against Arrow's shoulder, years of grief pouring out all at once. His fingers dug into Arrow's back, clinging to him as if afraid he might vanish again. I'm sorry, Arrow whispered, his own eyes filling with tears. I'm so sorry, Nick. Arrow felt his own composure crumbling. The weight of everything, waking up in that field, seeing his changed reflection, discovering 4 years of his life were missing, it all came crashing down. Tears streamed down his face as he held on to his best friend, the one familiar anchor in a world that had moved on without him. They stood there, 2 grown men crying in each other's arms, neither willing to let go. Arrow's tears soaked into Nicholas's shirt, and Nicholas's into the strange fabric of Arrow's clothes. I missed you so much, Nicholas said between sobs. Your funeral was the worst day of my life. I couldn't even, his voice broke. I couldn't even say goodbye properly. They never found your body. I'm here now, Arrow managed, his voice raw. I don't know where I've been, but I'm back. Eventually, the tears subsided, leaving both of them exhausted but somehow lighter. Nicholas pulled back, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Look at us, he said with a watery laugh. Cry like a couple of kids. Arrow smiled, wiping his own eyes. Yeah, well, I think we've earned it. Nicholas returned the smile, then his expression grew serious as he studied Arrow's face. Where'd you been all this time? We thought you were dead. There was a funeral and everything. Arrow returned the embrace, surprised by the lump forming in his throat. I don't know, he admitted. I woke up in a field today with no memory of the last 4 years. The last thing I remember is the ground opening up at Westbridge. Nicholas pulled back, wiping at his eyes. The sinkhole. It was all over the news. Half the campus just disappeared. They never found most of the bodies. He studied Arrow's face. But you survived. How? I don't know, Arrow repeated, gesturing to the strange markings on his arm. I woke up looking like this, wearing clothes I don't recognize. And apparently, I can create shields now. Yeah, I noticed that, Nicholas said, rubbing his shoulder where he'd hit the floor. That's not normal, dude. Tell me about it. They sat on the edge of Nicholas's bed, the initial shock giving way to a tentative normalcy. Nicholas couldn't stop staring at him, as if afraid Arrow might disappear again. What about my family? Arrow asked. I saw them earlier, but I scared Janelle. I didn't mean to. Nicholas's expression softened. They took it hard, man. Really hard. Your mom. She wouldn't accept it at first. Kept saying you were just missing, not dead. But after a year, even she had to let go. Arrow nodded, feeling a weight settle in his chest. They seemed different. Quieter. Yeah, Nicholas agreed. They are. They talked for hours, Nicholas filling Arrow in on everything he'd missed. Emily was in grad school now. Janelle had just started college. The town had built a memorial for those lost in what they called the collapse. By the time they'd exhausted their immediate questions, it was past midnight. Nicholas was mid-sentence when he suddenly started laughing, a genuine, relieved laugh that Arrow hadn't heard in what felt like forever. What's so funny? Arrow asked, smiling despite himself. I'm just glad my parents are visiting my aunt this weekend, Nicholas said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Can you imagine if they'd heard me yelling about a ghost in my bedroom? Arrow chuckled, feeling a sense of normalcy for the first time since he'd woken up in that field. Yeah, that would have been hard to explain. As they laughed together, Arrow felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to some version of his old life, even with all the unanswered questions and strange new abilities. What he didn't know was that across town, security camera footage of his encounter with the car was already being reviewed by wide-eyed police officers. And somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary knowledge, in a realm whose existence remained hidden from the world he knew, ancient eyes watched as ripples spread through shadowed waters, harbingers of the Marked One's return, a warrior bearing tattoos who had somehow crossed a boundary not meant to be breached.